As sport stabilized under authority, it began shaping not just competition, but identity, loyalty, and belonging. Once authority was fully embedded in sport, the game began doing more than organizing competition. It began organizing people. What had started as systems of order slowly evolved into systems of identity. Sport no longer simply reflected community. It helped define it. Teams became more than groups of players. They became symbols. Colors, names, and affiliations transformed competition into belonging. To support a team was to declare loyalty, not just to performance, but to place, identity, and shared meaning. Authority recognized this power quickly and learned to cultivate it. Leagues formalized identity by stabilizing membership. Teams did not appear and disappear freely. They were preserved, protected, and branded. Continuity mattered. Stability allowed loyalty to deepen over time. Fans could invest emotionally because the system promised endurance. Sport became something that could be inherited. This permanence reshaped how individuals related to competition. Participation was no longer fleeting. It was embedded in schedules, seasons, and rituals. Attendance became habit. Support became routine. Identity formed not through isolated moments, but through repetition. Authority reinforced these identities through structure. Schedules created anticipation. Rivalries were institutionalized. Championships provided narrative closure. The system did not invent emotion, but it organized it. Passion moved through approved channels, becoming predictable and manageable. Sport also offered a sense of order in an increasingly complex world. Clear outcomes, defined roles, and visible hierarchy contrasted with uncertainty elsewhere. Authority positioned sport as a space where rules applied consistently and outcomes were earned. This promise of fairness strengthened emotional attachment. Belonging carried responsibility. Fans were expected to support regardless of outcome. Loyalty mattered more than success. Authority benefited from this devotion, gaining stability even in failure. Identity ensured continuity when performance could not. This dynamic altered power relationships subtly. Once identity was attached, withdrawal became difficult. To question the system felt like betrayal. Criticism was tolerated, but abandonment was not. Authority learned that belonging could regulate behavior more effectively than rules alone. Athletes were shaped by this environment as well. They represented more than themselves. They carried collective identity. Performance failures affected communities. Success validated belonging. Pressure intensified as identity expanded beyond the individual. Media amplified these effects. Narratives framed competition as legacy rather than event. History mattered. Records became sacred. Authority curated memory, deciding which moments defined identity and which faded away. Belonging became historical as well as emotional. This process blurred boundaries between sport and culture. Teams became civic symbols. Competition reflected social values. Authority positioned sport as neutral, yet its identities were deeply embedded in broader structures of inclusion and exclusion. Belonging also created division. Loyalty defined insiders and outsiders. Rivalries sharpened identity by opposition. Authority benefited from this tension, channeling conflict into controlled expression. Sport offered a safe outlet for division without threatening structure. Over time, identity became inseparable from system. Fans did not merely watch sport, they inhabited it. Participation extended beyond play into conversation, ritual, and memory. Authority succeeded by embedding itself into daily life through belonging. This marked a further evolution of sports' role in society. Control no longer relied solely on rules or governance. It lived within identity itself. To belong was to accept the system. To reject the system was to risk isolation. As belonging solidified around teams and leagues, loyalty began to operate as a form of governance. Authority no longer needed to rely exclusively on rules or enforcement. Identity itself encouraged compliance. To belong was to accept norms, defend structure, and remain invested even when outcomes disappointed. Sport had learned to govern through attachment. This shift altered how power functioned. Rules still mattered, but loyalty reduced the need to invoke them. Fans policed one another's commitment. Athletes internalized expectations. Criticism was permitted, but only within bounds that preserved allegiance. Authority benefited from this self-regulation. The system enforced itself through emotion. Rituals reinforced this control. Scheduled games, seasonal rhythms, and recurring ceremonies created predictability. Attendance marked time. Results punctuated weeks and years. These patterns embedded sport into daily life, making participation habitual rather than optional. Authority gained stability through routine. Symbols deepened attachment. Uniforms, emblems, and colors condensed identity into visible form. They allowed individuals to signal belonging instantly. These symbols were protected carefully, regulated through licensing and policy. Authority understood that controlling symbols meant controlling meaning. Narratives further organized loyalty. Rivalries were framed as historic. Moments were elevated into legend. Losses were reinterpreted as endurance. Success was framed as validation. Authority curated these stories, selecting what mattered and what faded. Memory became institutional property. This narrative control shaped expectations. Fans learned how to interpret outcomes. Disappointment became part of loyalty rather than a reason to withdraw. The system trained participants to remain committed regardless of circumstance. Authority transformed uncertainty into continuity. Belonging also structured conflict. Rivalries allowed aggression without destabilization. Opposition was permitted, even encouraged, as long as it followed prescribed channels. Sport offered a controlled outlet for division, reducing the risk of disruption elsewhere. Authority managed tension by organizing it. Athletes experienced this pressure acutely. Representation expanded beyond performance. They embodied community identity. Mistakes carried symbolic weight. Success offered collective affirmation. Authority leveraged this responsibility to demand discipline and alignment. Individual autonomy narrowed as representational burden grew. Media intensified these dynamics. Coverage amplified loyalty, framing competition as drama with moral stakes. Heroes and villains were constructed. Neutrality was rare. Authority benefited from heightened engagement while retaining control over access and framing. Visibility followed loyalty. Economic structures reinforced attachment. Merchandise, tickets, and subscriptions monetized belonging. Investment became tangible. Leaving meant loss. Authority converted emotion into revenue without relinquishing power. Loyalty proved resilient even under strain. This system discouraged exit. Fans who disengaged lost community. Athletes who resisted risked isolation. Authority did not need to coerce departure. Social cost performed the work. Belonging became both reward and restraint. Over time, loyalty blurred into identity. Individuals described themselves through affiliation. Sport became part of self-definition. Authority embedded itself within personal narrative. To question structure felt like questioning oneself. This internalization marked a maturation of control. Governance no longer appeared external, it felt natural. Authority succeeded by aligning system goals with personal meaning. Compliance was reframed as passion, yet this alignment carried consequence. Critical distance diminished. Structural flaws persisted unchallenged. Loyalty protected the system from scrutiny. Authority thrived in this environment, absorbing energy without redistribution of power. Sport now functioned as a stable institution not just because it was organized, but because it was loved. Belonging proved more durable than rulebooks. Identity outlasted performance. Authority learned that the strongest systems are not enforced, they are embraced. As loyalty deepened, the next transformation followed naturally, the shaping of behavior beyond the field. When identity governs participation, conduct becomes subject to expectation. Sport began extending authority into speech, behavior, and values themselves. As loyalty and belonging settled into the structure of sport, authority extended its reach beyond competition and into conduct. What had once been governed primarily by rules of play now became governed by expectations of behavior. Sport did not simply ask participants to perform, it asked them to represent. This expansion of authority reframed participation. Athletes were no longer accountable only for what they did during competition. They were accountable for how they behaved, spoke, and presented themselves at all times. The boundary between play and personal life narrowed. Conduct became a condition of belonging. These expectations were rarely introduced as control. They were framed as responsibility. To represent a team, a league, or a community was described as an honor. With that honor came obligation. Authority justified oversight as protection of image, of values, of trust. In practice, it regulated expression. Codes of conduct formalized this shift. Written policies outlined acceptable behavior, language, and appearance. These codes extended authority into areas once considered personal. Compliance was mandatory, yet often framed as voluntary alignment with shared values. Discipline became procedural rather than confrontational. This regulation was unevenly experienced. Those with greater visibility faced stricter scrutiny. High-profile athletes became symbols, their behavior amplified and interpreted. Authority enforced standards more aggressively where attention was greatest. Visibility increased both influence and vulnerability. Speech became a focal point. Statements were weighed for impact. Silence could be interpreted as compliance or dissent, depending on context. Authority navigated this terrain carefully, balancing expression against stability. When speech threatened cohesion or commercial interest, regulation followed. This dynamic placed participants in constant negotiation. Expression carried risk. Conformity offered security. Many learned to self-regulate, avoiding controversy to preserve opportunity. Authority benefited from this restraint. Control no longer required enforcement. It was internalized. Fans absorbed these expectations as well. Support was tied to perceived alignment with values. Behavior off the field influenced loyalty on it. Authority cultivated this relationship, framing discipline as accountability. Community standards reinforced institutional ones. Media amplified behavioral governance. Coverage extended beyond competition into personal lives. Narratives framed conduct as character. Authority used this visibility to justify regulation, presenting oversight as response rather than imposition. Public reaction became a tool of enforcement. This environment reduced ambiguity. Clear expectations simplified management. Predictability protected investment. Authority preferred consistency over complexity. Difference was tolerated only when it could be managed without disruption. Yet this control came at cost. Authenticity narrowed. Individual expression was filtered through risk assessment. Creativity survived within boundaries, but dissent struggled. Authority preserved harmony by limiting variance. This regulation also reshaped leadership. Coaches and administrators became enforcers of conduct as much as performance. They mediated between individual and institution. Responsibility flowed downward, while decision-making remained centralized. Over time, behavior governance became normalized. New participants entered sport already aware of expectations. Compliance felt natural. Authority succeeded by embedding standards early, reducing resistance later. This normalization extended beyond athletes. Officials, staff, and even fans encountered behavioral boundaries. Language, gestures, and displays were regulated within venues. Authority shaped environment as well as action. Sport thus became a space where values were curated. Neutrality was claimed, but norms reflected institutional priorities. Authority decided which values were celebrated and which were discouraged. Inclusion and exclusion were managed through policy rather than confrontation. This governance of behavior strengthened stability. Conflict was reduced. Image was protected. Yet it also constrained evolution. Change required permission. Authority guarded continuity by limiting deviation. Participants adapted by learning when to comply and when to remain silent. Success depended on reading boundaries accurately. The system rewarded those who navigated expectations without challenging them. As conduct became regulated, authority achieved deeper integration. Control no longer ended at the field or the rulebook. It entered daily life, shaping how individuals moved through the world as representatives of sport. This marked another step in sport's institutional maturity. What began as organized play had become a comprehensive system of identity, loyalty, labor, and behavior. Authority no longer governed only competition. It governed culture. With conduct shaped and loyalty secured, the next transformation followed naturally. The extension of authority into values themselves, how sport came to define what it stood for, and who it was willing to include. Once authority extended into conduct, it inevitably moved into values. Sport no longer governed only what participants did or how they behaved. It began shaping what it claimed to represent. Values became the language through which authority justified decisions, resolved conflict, and defined legitimacy. These values were rarely neutral. They reflected institutional priorities: stability, continuity, growth, and control. Fairness, respect, and integrity were elevated as guiding principles, yet they were interpreted through structures designed to preserve order. Authority positioned itself as guardian of these values, framing governance as moral responsibility rather than power. This framing proved effective. When decisions were justified as value-based, they appeared principled rather than strategic. Discipline became accountability. Exclusion became standards. Authority avoided appearing coercive by grounding control in shared ideals. Compliance felt virtuous. Resistance felt disruptive. Values also provided flexibility. Unlike rules, they could be interpreted. This allowed authority to respond selectively to situations without appearing inconsistent. The same value could justify different outcomes depending on context. This ambiguity preserved discretion while maintaining legitimacy. Inclusion became a central expression of values. Sport spoke increasingly about belonging, access, and representation. These commitments were sincere in language, yet constrained in practice. Authority expanded participation carefully, ensuring new inclusion did not destabilize existing structures. Progress was managed rather than transformative. This management revealed the limits of value-based governance. When values conflicted with profit, stability, or tradition, authority prioritized continuity. Inclusion advanced when it aligned with institutional interest. When it challenged control, it slowed. Values provided cover for selective change. Participants navigated this environment cautiously. Alignment with institutional values offered protection. Public commitment reduced risk. Silence often served as neutrality. Authority rewarded visible adherence, reinforcing norms through recognition rather than enforcement. Fans absorbed these values as part of identity. Support became moral as well as emotional. Loyalty aligned with perceived righteousness. Authority benefited from this alignment, converting values into reinforcement of structure. Disagreement became framed as value conflict rather than structural critique. Media amplified value narratives. Stories framed sport as reflection of societal ideals. Authority positioned itself as responsive and responsible. Criticism was addressed through statements and initiatives, maintaining control of framing. Values became messaging tools. This emphasis on values also shaped memory. Historical moments were reinterpreted through contemporary ideals. Authority curated legacy, deciding which actions represented the true spirit of sport. Memory became a site of governance. Athletes experienced values as expectation. They were asked not only to perform and behave, but to embody ideals. This expectation expanded responsibility without expanding power. Representation carried risk. Authority benefited from moral labor without relinquishing control. Over time, values hardened into norms. What began as principles became assumptions. New participants entered sport already familiar with expected beliefs. Authority succeeded by embedding values early, reducing need for justification later. Yet values also constrained evolution. When ideals were institutionalized, deviation appeared dangerous. Innovation risked being framed as betrayal. Authority preserved stability by defining values narrowly. This narrowing shaped debate. Structural critiques were reframed as moral disagreements. Authority avoided addressing power directly by discussing values instead. Conversation shifted away from governance and toward symbolism. Sport thus became a moral institution as well as a competitive one. Authority governed not only through rules, loyalty, and conduct, but through ideals. Control was legitimized by claiming ethical purpose. This system proved resilient. Values absorbed criticism without redistributing power. Authority adapted language while preserving structure. Change occurred incrementally, within boundaries. The consequence was a sport that appeared principled while remaining controlled. Participants felt represented, yet rarely empowered. Authority maintained dominance through alignment rather than force. As values settled into place, the final transformation approached. When identity, loyalty, conduct, labor, and values are governed, the system reaches maturity. Sport no longer simply organizes competition or community. It defines meaning. The final slide examines this culmination. What it means for sport to exist as a complete institution. and what is gained and lost when play becomes purpose, identity, and authority all at once. By the time sport reached this stage, it no longer relied on any single form of control. Rules, loyalty, conduct, labor, and values worked together, reinforcing one another. Authority no longer needed to announce itself. It was built into how sport functioned, how it was understood, and how it was lived. Play still existed. Competition still mattered. Emotion still surged. But all of it moved through systems designed to preserve stability, meaning, and continuity. What once emerged organically was now curated. What once belonged to participants was now shared with institutions that managed its future. This did not make sport false or empty. It made it durable. The structures that limited freedom also ensured survival. Authority did not replace passion. It organized it. It did not erase belonging. It defined it. The game endured because it adapted to permanence. Yet permanence carries cost. When systems harden, flexibility narrows. When identity is governed, dissent becomes difficult. When values are institutionalized, change slows. Sport gains stability, but it risks forgetting the uncertainty that once gave play its meaning. What remains is a tension that never fully resolves, between freedom and order, between expression and control, between play as experience and sport as institution. That tension is not a failure of sport. It is its condition. As long as people care deeply about games, authority will shape them. And as long as authority shapes sport, the question will remain, not whether control exists, but how much of play it allows to survive.